Tonight we are looking at Vasily Ivanchuk against Alexei-Shirov. This game was played in 1996, and it's a well-known game, and it's very exemplary of the type of creative player that Ivanchuk is. He's known to play a lot of different openings, and I mean he's come up with a lot of interesting ideas. So he has lots of masterpiece games, but conversely, he also tends to lose. He's very, I guess I would say, streaky. He'll either be a genius in a tournament and come in first or second, or he'll really falter and lose a lot. So. And Alexei Shirov is no slouch either. He is he's from Latvia. I believe he currently lives in Spain. And he is known as a great tactician. He likes highly tactical fighting chess. So a game between these two guys is you're bound to have some excitement. So Ivanchuk starts with d4, d5, and we have a Slav. Whenever black plays c6, that's called the Slav defense. Bishop to g5. Now, if black plays here, bishop to e7, or knight b to d7, that would be getting into Queen's Gambit territory. Queen's Gambit declined. But Shirov, being the aggressive player, he plays a very sharp line, which leads to a lot of tactical play. He plays d takes c4. Now, this is known as the Botvinnik variation. It was created, or it's attributed to Mikhail Botvinnik, who was the world chess champion in the late 40s, early 50s, and actually early 60s as well. Okay, so white takes the center. These are two nice central pawns, and he's also threatening to regain his pawn back by taking on c4. b5. He pushes ahead. So the knight is pinned. Knight is pinned. If you move the knight, then you lose the queen. So black is forced to attack the bishop. Once the bishop moves, black will be able to move the knight. g5. Now white has to make a decision. Does he retreat the bishop and keep the bishop, or does he take the knight? Or alternatively, he sacrifices his knight to maintain the pin. So white gets two pawns, but he's maintaining the pin on the knight on f6, and so he takes back. Okay, so what's the story here? Black has 6 pawns, white has 7 pawns. So currently white is up a pawn. Both sides have 3 minor pieces, and both sides also have a queen and 2 rooks. So the difference right here is that white is currently up 1 pawn, but this pawn here, it's currently being attacked by 2 guys. So maybe white is going to have a hard time holding on to it, but we'll see. g3. Now that at first glance looks absolutely insane to play. because you are lining up your rook with the opponent's bishop. But this line is very concrete. This is the Botvinnik variation. It's very concrete, and there's been a lot of theory and study on this line. So sometimes in such variations that are concrete and tactical, you will see some moves that just kind of look mind-boggling at first. I would never expect to see g3 in this position, but let's see what white does. So c5 is played. That's the natural move. Hit the bishop. Hit the rook with the bishop. Okay, so now we see the idea. By getting black to play c5, it loosens up the b5 pawn, because previously the c pawn was holding on to it. And in order to defend against the threat on the rook, white is simply blocking up the diagonal. Okay, queen b6, that is to prepare for castling. I suspect, if we go back here, I suspect after here, yeah, this isn't good. We're going to lose a piece, and probably more. There's a nasty check against the king. King currently doesn't have any squares, so we either need to give up our knight or we give up our bishop. And so that's why black cannot take the pawn. So queen b6, preparing to go to the queen side. Bishop g2, develop the bishop, and as advertised. So let's look at the situation here now. It's still white is up a pawn. In terms of king safety, I would say that, well, both kings are fairly safe. I mean, black's king is castled, and even though white's king is not castled, he is soon ready to castle. So king safety currently is not an issue. Let's take a look at what white decided to play here. There you go, he castled, that's natural. Okay, advancing with the queenside pawns. So this is a very intimidating pawn storm happening on the queen side. Attacking the knight, also getting our knight out of being attacked by this pawn. So knight a4 makes sense. Okay, queen to b5. The queen is staying nearby the pawns in order to support their advance, and also is staying connected to the bishop in case this bishop ever trades it. You know, gives black the option of taking back with the queen. a3, so white is trying to break up this pawn mass and perhaps put a rook on an open file if these pawns can get out of the way. Okay, black takes on d5, white takes on b4, black takes back. And now white plays bishop to e3. Excuse me, hitting the a7 pawn, and also just putting the bishop targeting that side of the board towards the black king. So black plays knight to c5 to block the bishop. Now, curious, it looks like black can take the pawn on f6 with the knight, but I believe that is going to be bad news. The first move that comes to mind would be queen to d4, hitting the knight and also hitting this pawn. If the knight moves, well, the rook is lost. So if we consider bishop to g7, queen takes a7, and knight b6 is coming. Perhaps rook a5 to hit the queen. This looks very nasty. So that is why black did not take the pawn on f6 with the knight, but rather said, hey, I better shut down this diagonal, because that's a strong diagonal. Okay? So, here, Ivanchuk played queen to g4 check. The rook blocked the check, and now, in this position, Ivanchuk played a spectacular move. Absolutely spectacular move that optically, at first, doesn't look like it's a good move. So what do you think Ivanchuk played at this situation? Well, he played the spectacular, oops, just a sec now, how come it's not moving? He played the spectacular queen to g7. Unbelievable that such a move would even come to the attention of a grandmaster. Putting the queen en prise by the bishop on f8, also hitting the rook at the same time. So basically black pretty much has to take. And so right now, white has a bishop for the in exchange for the queen, but you'll notice the bishop on f8 was holding on to the knight. So once black decided to take the queen, that means the knight is loose. Okay, so let's look at this situation. Black has a queen, and white has a knight and a bishop in exchange. That's the material situation, but positionally, black really doesn't have much going on. There's no attack against white's king. Yes, there's a pawn storm happening, but because black castled queenside, these pawns aren't going to move anytime soon, because if they do, they're going to open up lines towards the king. Now let's look at white, his position. Nice open A file. Two bishops that are just ready to dominate and attack the black king. And this knight is on a beautiful square protected by a piece and is currently attacking two of black's pieces. So I know the evaluation bar is minus 1.2, and you know, maybe with best play. A computer could hold this, but in a practical game between two humans, facing these problems over the board, I think it would be quite a challenge to play black in this position. So let's see how Shirov... Oops, I'm sorry. Oh, goodness, I'm sorry, guys. Let me fix that. My apologies. My apologies. I hit the wrong key. Okay, here we go. Alright, my apologies, guys. Okay, so here, the rook is attacked, but Shirov moves forward with the d pawn. Now, a consequence of that, he has unleashed the beast on g2. Ivanchuk takes the bishop on b7. Rook takes the knight, or takes the rook, pardon me. Now, queen to b6. That's interesting. I think the reason... Okay, so let's look at why black did not take the knight. So if black took the knight with the queen, there would follow bishop takes d4, pressuring the a pawn, but more importantly, holding on to the g7 pawn. So in effect, you could say that black is playing queen versus two rooks, because this rook is basically tied down to looking at this pawn. So that's why he couldn't take the knight. And of course, he's not going to be able to take the bishop because of, whoops, a knight fork. Hot tamale. So that's why Shirov played queen to b6. Okay. And Ivanchuk took the pawn anyway. Let's see why. Opens up the lines. So right here, queen takes b2. Check. Hits the queen again. Okay. So he gave up the bishop on e3, and in exchange, the three pawns that used to be here for black, it's only one. The king has been drawn out, and from black's perspective, he's been able to get rid of the g7 pawn. Materially, black, if you count the material, is slightly up, but positionally, white has all the trumps, especially because if you look at the kings, white's king is much safer than black's king. White has all three of his pieces surrounding the black king. White's king is fine. There's no immediate checks on the back rank, and he could always go up to g2 if need be. Okay, check, takes. So now the pressure was so much that Shirov decided to give up the rook for the knight, and now we have an endgame where it's queen against two rooks, and generally the two rooks are to be favored. 10 points versus 9 materially, and also piece play. The rooks really support each other really well, and when you're the one with just the queen, it's tough facing an opponent that has those two rooks. So Ivanchuk checks the king, brings the rook back, and so not too surprisingly at grandmaster play, here Shirov resigned. So we can imagine, either rook c1 to go after this pawn, or doubling up on the d file. And going after the king. There's also potentials for rook c1 and then, oops, my apologies, rook c1 and rook c8, being able to pick off the c pawn. I think here it's going to be hard for black to hold on to the c pawn. And if white can exchange the two rooks for this pawn and the queen, then it'll be 3 white pawns against 1 f7 pawn. So that is most likely why Shirov threw in the towel. So an amazing idea by Ivanchuk. Let me just go back to it. Where were we? So here was the position. So in this position, white has just played queen to g4, checking the king. Black blocked with the rook, and then Ivanchuk played the unbelievable queen to g7. Unbelievable. It's quite a move.